Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kimberly Hobbs. I am the Executive Director of Central Alabama Fair Housing Center. And we are so pleased that you're able to join us for this event and in celebration of the Fair Housing Month, which I'm not sure if everybody knows, April is Fair Housing Month. This year marks the 53rd year since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. It's a time to commemorate and to celebrate the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1968, also known as the Fair Housing Act, and a time to focus on all the work that we still need to do. This pandemic and this past administration has highlighted all of the work that still needs to be done, and we are furiously working towards equality. So today it is my pleasure to introduce to you Mr. Aaron Glantz. He is the Senior Investigations Editor at NPR's California Newsroom, and the author of Homewreckers, and it's a long title, so I'm going to try and say it all. So Homewreckers, How a Gang of Wall Street Kingpins, Hedge Fund Magnates, crooked banks, and Vulture capitalists suckered millions out of their homes and demolished the American dream. He previously served as a senior investigator at Reveal, and earlier last year, he shared his investigation into hidden organizations and individuals buying up homes across America. He is a two-time Peabody Award winner, finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, multi-Emmy Award nominee, and former John S. Knight Journalism Fellow at Stanford University. Mr. Glantz has had his work appear in the New York Times, Chicago Tribune, NBC News Nightly, Good Morning America, and the PBS NewsHour. And today he will speak to us on the topic of renewing the American dream.
Well, thank you so much, Kimberly, for that introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to try here to put up some slides for us, and we will see how that works. Hold on 1 minute. Can you all see me and this slide? Are we having good work here?
Yeah, it looks great from our end.
Okay, so fantastic. So thank you so much for Kimberly for that introduction. Thank you so much to the Central Alabama Fair Housing Center for inviting me to talk during Fair Housing Month. I'm going to talk about two big investigations that I've done over recent years and what they mean for our ability to live the American dream. The first is a investigation that I did at Reveal with my colleague Emmanuel Martinez called Kept Out. And we looked at 31 million loan records all across America for the years 2015 and 2016. And we found that as recently as a few years ago, people of color were still far more likely to be denied a home loan than whites, even when they made the same amount of money, tried to take out the same size loan and buy in the same neighborhood. And this was true in 61 cities, and that included Montgomery, Mobile, Tuscaloosa, and Huntsville in Alabama. And when I say that, it doesn't mean that there's no problem in other places, but when we did this analysis, we were able to definitively show that in these markets that Black and brown folks were more likely to get turned down by a significant margin, even when they had the same financial characteristics. And then the second investigation I'm going to talk about is the book that Kimberly mentioned, Homewreckers, which talks about who profited off of the loss of equity that followed the 2008 housing bust, and how they make even more money thanks to the discrimination that I mentioned before. So let's talk about the American dream for a second. We have this idea that home ownership is key to the American dream. It's been around forever. But actually, home ownership, as we think of it today, is a relatively new phenomenon that dates back just to the New Deal. And it was coined by James Truslow Adams in this book called The Epic of America. And he wrote, "The American dream is a dream of being able to grow to the fullest development as a man or woman, unhampered by barriers which had slowly been erected in older civilizations, presented by social orders which had developed for the benefit of classes rather than for the simple human being of any and every class." Basically, what Adams, who was a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, was arguing was that unlike Europe, where land passed from kings and queens and dukes and lords and and you couldn't move up if you were just a regular worker, that in America, if you worked hard, you could own a piece of the American dream. As we know, when he said that in 1931, it was not fulfilled. And actually, at that point in 1931, pretty much the only people who were able to own property, except for the very, very rich, were farmers. That if you moved to the city, you're probably renting, because the American system of finance was completely broken. And a lot of the loans that were available at that time in 1931 would be considered predatory products today, like interest-only mortgages that end in a balloon payment after 5 years. Was a very, very common loan to have in the 1920s. This changed in 1933. President Franklin Roosevelt was elected, and he sent Congress a letter demanding a radical change, a declaration of national policy that homeownership needed to be presented as a guarantee of social and economic stability. And he founded this organization called the Homeowners Loan Corporation. We're in the midst of the Depression. And what this bank did, this government bank, is it went in and it bought loans from banks for pennies on the dollar, and then issued new loans to families over a 20-year period at reasonable interest rates that they could pay back. They refinanced, this government bank refinanced 1 out of every 5 mortgages in urban America. It saved 1 million homes. It actually made a profit for the taxpayer, because when you bet on the American people, it's a good bet. And Roosevelt then built on this success with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the Fair Housing Administration, the GI Bill, all of these tools that helped homeownership blossom in the aftermath of World War II. Now, there is a big, big problem, though, with these great programs, which is that it invented redlining. Redlining. So for that Homeowners Loan Corporation, there were government employees who literally went out all across America, drawing lines on maps and coloring neighborhoods that were black or brown red, and telling banks that participated in these government lending programs not to lend in these neighborhoods. And they used explicitly racist language. So here's the map of Montgomery from back in the 30s. And this description is from the area that at that time was the State Teachers College, which is now Alabama State. And you can see here that this neighborhood was colored red. Banks were told not to lend here by the federal government. Even though the people of color who lived in this neighborhood mostly had college degrees and were professors, doctors, and mail carriers, but they were still told, don't lend in these red line neighborhoods. And we had horrible generational loss of equity in this country for African Americans especially, but also for many immigrant groups and even Jews for many, many years because of this policy. Because they were systematically kept out of those policies of Franklin Roosevelt to allow families to own homes and build wealth. So what happened after that? The Civil Rights Movement. We have a cascade of laws beginning in 1968 with Lyndon Johnson signing the Fair Housing Act banning housing discrimination. That is what we're here for, Fair Housing Month, commemorating we are now 53 years after this historic law. 1974, Richard Nixon signs the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. Builds on the Fair Housing Act, says doesn't matter what kind of consumer credit is, you can't be discriminated against. 1975, Nixon signs the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, which forces banks to tell the public the demographics of the people they're lending to so we can hold them accountable. And then in 1977, President Jimmy Carter signs the Community Reinvestment Act. And it's an affirmative action law basically for banks, which says that they can't just say, oh, not enough Black people applied. They have to go out, make sure they have branches in communities all across the city, making sure that they offer advertising that's appropriate for all parts of the community. And the language in the law is an affirmative obligation to help meet the credit needs of the communities where they are chartered. And so this cascade of laws throughout the 60s and 70s to solve the historic inequities of redlining. But we all know that despite these laws, that problems persist. And in fact, in 2018, the African-American homeownership rate was lower than it was during the Jim Crow era. And the homeownership gap between Black and white families was larger than during the Jim Crow era. And the average white family was worth 15 times as much as the average African-American one, and also worth way more than 10 times more than the average Latino family. And this is largely because of the homeownership gap, because every single month, our largest expense is our housing expense, and either we pay it in rent to our landlord or we put it in our mortgage payment and build wealth for our family. And yet, despite all of the statistics that I just gave that are so bleak, the government was ranking 98% of banks satisfactory or outstanding when it came to complying with the Community Reinvestment Act. So we have this absolutely terrible situation of inequality in this country, pervasive problems in mortgage lending, but all the banks are being given a good job rating. So my colleague, Emmanuel Martinez, and I, we did this big investigation looking at 31 million mortgage records all across America, and found some disturbing patterns that I mentioned earlier. And the question would be, how could you have a law that said that banks cannot discriminate, have another law that says that banks have an affirmative obligation to lend to all parts of the community, and at the same time have such a bad outcome? So one of the first things that we looked at was the growth of non-bank lenders. Banks are required to follow this Community Reinvestment Act, but non-banks are not. And in Philadelphia, which was a city we focused on, where African Americans and whites make up basically the same percentage of the population, but whites were getting 10 times as many conventional mortgage loans, and African Americans were 3 times more likely to be denied a loan, even when they made the same amount of money, tried to take out the same size loan and live in the same neighborhood. And, in this day and age, you don't get told, we're not lending to you because you're Black. That would be a clear violation of the Fair Housing Act. So we wanted to know, well, how does this operationalize itself? And it was actually really hard to find families who are willing to talk about their experiences being redlined, because they did not know that they had been redlined, because the banks don't tell you this. So what we ended up doing was focusing on the white people who did get loans. And a lot of them told us that they didn't face a lot of scrutiny from the banks. And then we started to look at the demographics, the people who worked for these institutions, and the loopholes that were provided. I'm just going to play a little clip from a segment that we did for the PBS NewsHour that looked at Trident Mortgage Corporation, which is one of these companies. So you can see that what we found was that there were these lending institutions that were creating all white worlds. that they were operating in Philadelphia and in other cities. So Trident Mortgage Company was the largest lender in Philly. It's part of a giant mortgage empire built by Warren Buffett. It lent almost exclusively to whites. It put its offices, it had 55 loan centers across Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and every single one of them was in a majority white neighborhood. Its staff was 82% white. And we found similar patterns in Atlanta, Washington, D.C., and other major markets where his company operated. So after we did this story, the Pennsylvania Attorney General opened a fair housing investigation into this company. But you can see how in this world that we live in today, where people are not told that they are being discriminated against, how difficult it can be and how you often need to do a data-driven investigation like we did to spotlight the pattern. This is Rochelle Ferrule. We focused on her as well. She was working at the University of Pennsylvania, which is an Ivy League institution, as an administrator, and she was denied a home loan by 2 different financial institutions. And this is another area that we thought really explained a lot because, again, looking at the way people get treated, there are all these rules. Your income has to be stable. Your savings have to be a certain amount. The value of the loan you're taking out to the value of the property has to be a certain amount. But lenders have discretion, and we found that lenders use their discretion in certain ways. And so this is just another clip after Rochelle was denied a loan twice by 2 different lenders, how she solved her problem. So this is basically what we found, that the white people were allowed to skate. And it was less of a story, it was a story about white privilege and explaining the disparities when we went deep in Philadelphia. Before I move on to talking about the people who are profiting off of this, I want to give some indication of hope here, which is that as a result of that series of stories that I just mentioned, major banks, including Chase and TD Bank, announced plans to open branches in Black neighborhoods in Philly and Washington, D.C., which is another market that we focused on. The city of Philadelphia created a revolving loan fund to help first-time homebuyers with down payments. Philadelphia also launched a second look program in collaboration with the banks to give mortgage denials more scrutiny. I already mentioned that the Attorney General of Pennsylvania launched an investigation to Warren Buffett's mortgage companies. Dozens of media outlets across the country, including in Alabama, used our analysis to do their own stories. And I testified before Congress about how to close some loopholes in the Community Reinvestment Act. And now that the presidency has changed hands, some of those ideas are very much in circulation. So that was all good. In terms of the profiteering off of this mess, it is really easiest to focus on a single house. And so this is one of the houses that I write about in my book, Homewreckers. It's an 800 square foot home in South LA, right near the the corner of Florence and Normandy, which is where the Rodney King uprising happened 30 years ago. And this is what it looked like when I visited the house in about when was I there? 2018. So this is, it's a story of Beulah and M.L. Butler, and this is a photo of them in 1948 that was taken in Macomb, Mississippi, right before they decided to drive west to Los Angeles. Beulah worked as a maid in Mississippi, and her husband worked in the cotton fields, and they had basically had enough, and they decided, like so many others in the post-war period, to drive west. They ended up, ML ended up getting a job as a mail carrier. Beulah ended up working for a defense contractor. And in 1963, the same year that California passed its version of the Fair Housing Act, 5 years before the federal law, they were able to buy that house and begin to make a home there. They raised their family. But ML died in 1991. He died very young. And as Beulah grew older, she went and got a reverse mortgage. This is one of these predatory mortgage products where the bank gives you a relatively small amount of money often, and then piles interest and fees and compounds them on top of each other. You never have to pay the principal back, but when you die, your family is stuck with a bill, and if you can't pay it, your family loses the house, and the bill can be quite high. So in this case, it was Steve Mnuchin's bank, our recent Treasury Secretary, that foreclosed on the family. And his bank foreclosed on tens of thousands of families all across the country. And because of financial subsidies made available to banks after the 2008 crash, we ended up paying him, the people of America, paid him and his bank over $1 billion as they foreclosed on families like the Butlers. And then the house was put up for auction, and it was bought by a company run by Tom Barrack. This is a photo of him speaking at the 2016 Republican National Convention, where he introduced Donald Trump. And this house was one of more than 30,000 homes that his company bought all across America in the wake of the housing crisis. They paid $180,000 for that house. I don't know what that sounds like in Alabama, but in California, it sounds quite cheap. The family, today, that house would be worth approximately $500,000. He bought it at auction for $180,000. And then what he did was he bundled the house together with 4,000 other homes and took out a giant $500 million loan. And what this allowed him to do was go out and buy still more homes, while the tenants in these 4,000 homes that he bought paid him back with their rent. And he could just grow and grow his empire. And that's one of the ways that he ended up owning 30,000 homes. And who funded that? JP Morgan Chase. So to think for a moment about the discrimination that we're talking about in the redlining story, Chase is one of these large banks that was disproportionately giving loans to whites, basically failing to loan to African Americans in many major American cities. And in fact, I looked at Chase's lending through the FHA program, which is designed to help working class Americans. And what I found was that in 2015, JP Morgan Chase extended 4 times as much money to Tom Barrack's rental empire as it did in government-backed loans to all working class Americans combined. And this is really important because when we talk about who can buy a home and who can't, we're not really talking about how much money you have. We all have money to pay rent. What we're talking about is people's ability to obtain financing. And what we're seeing here in this slide is that the biggest bank in America, JP Morgan Chase, was choosing to finance Tom Barrack, Donald Trump's best friend, instead of working class Americans all over this country. So when I visited this house in 2018, the person living there was named Sean Pruitt. And he used to own his own house too. It was a small farm in Texas, but he moved out to California because he needed medical treatment and he was dying of cancer and sick with AIDS. And he wanted to live near UCLA in Los Angeles where he could get better medical care. But he was facing a barrier, which is that this corporate landlord kept raising his rent over and over again. And actually, they also forced him to sign a lease that forced him to pay more, be more responsible for the upkeep of the property. If the plumbing burst, he had to fix it. If the window broke, he had to fix it. If you went into the backyard, there was this kumquat tree that the Butler family had planted that had grown so big that its limbs were tangled in the electrical wire, but he couldn't fix it, and the company's lease with him said that it was his responsibility. And then this is Beulah's son, Marcus. He was renting too. He's paying thousands of dollars a month to rent a relatively small apartment. And as you can see behind him, that is actually his wife who was stuck in a hospital bed after a stroke. And so he did not have the family's house anymore to provide stability. He could have borrowed against the value of his house to take care of his wife as she was sick. But instead he couldn't. And he was retired after working at the airport as a baggage guy for many, many years and really did not have much of a pension to live off of and did not have that cushion of home ownership that was lost thanks to the foreclosure. And I asked him, what do you think about all this? And he says, I guess this is the way the game is played. So I did that story about that house and I wrote the book, and the impact of that was that Tom Barrett cashed out of his company. He quit it, but it's not like he was hurting. He made $127 million in a single day selling his stock. And the guy who bought the company was Steve Schwartzman, who is the founder of Blackstone, the largest private equity company in America. And it was then part of a rental empire of 80,000 homes. This house that had been the dream for the Butler family was now just one part of an 80,000 home rental empire. And then Blackstone, because real estate prices had gone up, rather than a family taking advantage of that equity, they bundled it together into a new mortgage-backed security, which was $1 billion. And then they cashed out of the rental housing company as well. And now the company is called Invitation Homes. It's listed on the New York Stock Exchange. And now the owners of this house and 80,000 others across America are like mutual funds and life insurance companies and whoever happens to buy the stock. And that was all before COVID. So I was actually talking a little bit, I know people are facing a lot of hardship right now, but I have been urging folks to imagine how much worse it could be if the government did not take some decisions that represented lessons learned from the 2008 crash. And this is especially remarkable because the people in charge when this pandemic started, like Steve Mnuchin, who was our Treasury Secretary, were just looking at this as another chance to profit. He said there will be areas of the economy where this will be the best thing that ever occurred. This man who made a ton of money foreclosing on families during the last crisis. But, you know, there were some things that were done right. There's loopholes in all of this, and Kimberly and I were talking before we started about some problems, but there's a foreclosure moratorium nationwide on government-backed mortgages. There is an eviction moratorium that has been uneven, but has provided some protection. There's federal rent relief in the latest stimulus, which is uneven in its rollout, but exists and did not exist in 2008. There's mortgage forbearance. If you own your home and the government is backing up your mortgage, which is 85% of people, that you can put off payments because of COVID, and then you can exit forbearance with a new loan at a low interest rate that pushes payments out into the future so you don't face any balloon payment. And none of those things were available after the 2008 housing crash. So I think we have to show some appreciation. And, you know, there's also a lot of state and local laws designed to prevent history from repeating itself. And I was so happy last week, I edited a story here in California related to a new law here that was sparked by the publication of Homewreckers, that allowed this woman, Jocelyn Foreman, a formerly homeless outreach worker for the Unified School District in Berkeley, California. She just became the first person to take advantage of a new California law that gives tenants and nonprofits an exclusive 45-day window to match bids made by speculators at auction. This is huge. If you think, imagine when that house was put up for auction and Tom Barrack bought it, the Butler house. If the Butlers knew that they could come, if they had 45 days to come up with $180,000 through financing, they may very well have been able to save that home. And that is exactly what Jocelyn Foreman just did. After we publicized her case in the media, the community stepped forward and raised a couple $100,000, and it was then bought by a land trust, which is, so she gets to stay in the home, but then the land trust will own it in perpetuity, keeping it affordable for the next generation. So just what we did before, it worked. If you think about what Roosevelt did, creating affordable mortgage options for people, getting rid of predatory practices, having the government throw its weight behind the American family instead of these speculators. We just need to not be racist like we were back in the 30s. And because of this history of racism that we have in this country, the programs that we devise today need to specifically address the inequities of the past and the realities of modern day redlining that I mentioned at the outset. And it's also important to know that the homewreckers are just sitting there waiting for all of this to fail. They're waiting for the foreclosure moratoria to end. They're waiting for families to be struggling more than they are now and losing their homes. Blackstone, the company that eventually sold Invitation Homes after amassing 80,000 homes, is sitting on $150 billion in what they call dry powder. They can run out and spend $150 billion, just like you or I might be able to spend, 25 bucks on lunch, right? That is how much money they have sitting in the bank to spend. And they are not spending it yet. Steve Schwartzman said April 23rd last year, as the pandemic was starting, he said, distress takes time to play out. So because of all those moratoria that we have, because of that rent relief, we are not facing as much distress that these guys feel like it's a profit center, but that could come. So I want to thank you all for letting me go on Zoom for a little while. I know that it's not the most interactive, but for all of you here, I would love to get questions. And I see some questions in the chat here. So please, anyone who has anything, go ahead and raise your hand or just write any question in the chat.
Hold on. Sorry, Hi, sorry.
Hey, Kimberly.
So I had a few questions for you. And just watching your presentation, I was wondering, did you work with any fair housing organizations while you were conducting your lending investigations? Or did you try to consult with any of us?
Yes, I did. So when we were working on, I didn't play those whole stories because I wanted to keep this moving, but I worked a great deal with the Fair Housing Center of Southeastern Pennsylvania, as well as with the National Fair Housing Alliance, and also with some attorneys who specialize in this and former Justice Department officials. What I observed when we were on the ground in Philadelphia was that we were actually bringing a lot of information to the table that they did not know. For example, the Fair Housing Center of Southeastern Pennsylvania was shocked to learn that even the more affluent parts of Philly were still facing discrimination. Like, because Philly is a city with, if you know Philly, like Germantown, Mount Airy, like these are neighborhoods that are African-American neighborhoods that are upper middle class, wealthy neighborhoods. And we found in our analysis that they were still not being treated well by the banks. And they were totally unaware of Warren Buffett's company, which I mentioned, because their focus was on the banks. And so they were blindsided by the presence of these firms that were not banks, but were almost exclusively serving white people. On the other hand, they were really able to infuse us with knowledge about how we should examine these facts, right, and interpret them and present our findings in a way that could deliver relief to the public. And so one of the reasons that we structured that investigation to Trident Mortgage Company the way we did, focusing on the geographic locations of their offices, the staffing of the company, people of color versus whites as loan officers, et cetera, was because of the guidance we got from fair housing groups.
Okay, yeah, great. I think that's something that we've struggled with here, is that we do try and focus on banks and local lenders. So whenever you look who's behind that, so maybe we're getting lost in the forest and not.
Well, the HMDA data is the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data is great, and you can pull it down. And the first question I would ask is, who are the largest, most significant lenders in Montgomery for home purchase, for refinance, right? And if they're a bank, go look at them. And if they're not a bank, then they might deserve your scrutiny as well. And over 50% of all lending in this country right now is done by non-banks. And none of them face any scrutiny under the Community Reinvestment Act. That means that these federal banking regulators at the FDIC and the Federal Reserve are not looking at them. So that means that we need to look at them and make sure that they're following the rules.
Okay. And then I guess another question that we face a lot, and I would love to hear how you address it doing the investigations that you've done, is a lot of people that we present to or speak with argue that we have the laws in place that segregation and discrimination are illegal. So any lingering segregation that we have now is de facto or by choice. Have you been faced with those questions, and how would you answer them?
Well, again, this is where the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act data can be really helpful. And I would say that obviously, we did a lot of work in Philly. Philly is a city where you can still cross the street and see a tremendous difference in demographics. Like, I'm speaking to you from San Francisco. My house is in a neighborhood that is like 15% white, 40% Asian, 20% Latino. I mean, we're quite integrated we have a lot of kind of 21st century race problems and segregation problems here in the Bay Area, but Philly is a place where it's very old school in the way these problems manifest. And so you look at the system of finance, right? Are people being treated equally by the banks? Who is providing the financing? And gentrification can be a really important issue to look at, when it comes to finance, because one of the things that we found in Philly is that there was an impression that the white people who were getting loans and buying homes were wealthier than the longtime African-American residents of those same neighborhoods who could not get credit. We found that was not true. That when you looked at the data and you controlled for income and you controlled for the price of the house, that it was simply easier for the white people to get financing. And then when I went out and I talked to the white people who got loans, I would like hang out in the yuppie coffee shop that moved into the black neighborhood and just talk to people about how they bought their house. They would say like, oh yeah, I work 2 jobs and I have a lot of student loan debt, but I was able to convince the bank that I have a lot of earning potential after I graduate, right? It wasn't like the bank was making a bad decision. the bank was bending the rules because this person was a good bet for a loan, but the bank would not be willing to bend those same rules when confronted with a person with a different skin color. And so I think that looking at the ways that the banks behaved in gentrifying neighborhoods proved really, really important to our investigation.
Okay, and then I'm sorry, I'm asking a lot of questions. So your investigation, you seem to have focused on HMDA data. I know you said that you spoke to some individuals. With you working with the fair housing organizations, did they help you to conduct any sort of testing investigations into lending discrimination or discrimination that might have occurred?
You know, we did not do testing in this particular story, but I think that that is a very important thing to do. You all are very lucky to live in Alabama where you can surreptitiously record people.
Yes.
In California, where I live, that is illegal. We are a two-party consent state. And in Philly, where we conducted that investigation, is also a two-party consent state. So we had a debate about, actually, we found discrimination in 61 cities across this country. And our attorney suggested that we focus on Memphis, because Memphis is a huge city with gigantic problems with discrimination in housing. And also you can do a hidden camera investigation legally. But we thought that it was really important to do the story in the Northeast to prove that this is a national problem. It's not only a problem in the South. And so we forewent doing the testing, but it's a very important piece of the puzzle. Absolutely.
Okay. And I'm actually stealing a little bit from Taffany here, but she mentions, and you mentioned early gentrification. And I think that's a newer way of discrimination that not everybody's familiar with. Montgomery's seeing it now. I don't think we've seen it so much in the past. It's becoming a new issue here, where our city is being revitalized, but it's also displacing its past tenants and citizens, and we're seeing sort of a large scale repurchase of Montgomery, and then people again being moved out. And you know, how, I guess, have you seen it in the past? And with this new way to discriminate, how do you think it can be combated?
I think that, you know, the gentrification debate is very live all over this country. And I think that the part of the debate that goes underappreciated, undercovered, is who is financing it, right? Who, like all these people that I talked about, the white home buyers in Philly, to the big time speculators like Tom Barrack and Steve Mnuchin and Steve Schwartzman, they're all borrowing money. Every single one of them is borrowing money. None of them are playing with their own money. So we need to get out of this debate over rich people pushing out poor people. That happens. But what we should really be asking is, who is providing the financing, right? And do we have mechanisms to provide financing in a just and fair way? Right. And that's what the Community Reinvestment Act was supposed to guarantee, that if you lived in a community, that the banks would lend to you. Right. And that you would have a fair shot of getting financing. And so I think that we should be holding the financial institutions accountable in this regard as part of the ongoing debate. There is a bank in San Francisco called First Republic Bank. It is a pretty big national bank, and it is the favorite bank of people, kind of like that Warren Buffett financial institution in Philly, is a favorite financial institution for people coming in and gentrifying neighborhoods, right? And so, you know, pointing out to the federal regulators that these institutions may be complying with the letter of the law, but they are actually undercutting the spirit of the law is really important. Talking to your elected representatives about maybe changing the law could be important. A lot has changed in America since 1968 and 1977, but these laws have not been updated.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm not seeing any. While we're waiting for more questions, can you tell us a little bit more about your book and where we can purchase it?
Yeah, so I mean, Homewreckers, I published this book in 2019, and I updated it through the pandemic to kind of take us through the impact of another potential foreclosure wave. And the reason that I decided to write it was I just started to ask myself, and this is a really important question that people should be asking, like 8 million people lost their homes during the Great Recession. They did not just disappear, right?
Mm-hmm.
What happened to them? Who ended up owning them, and what are they using them for? And the real moment where I thought, okay, well, instead of just doing an article about it, I should write a book, is I found that house in South LA. And I said, here's this one house that was owned by the same African-American family for 50 years. They had migrated from the South to the West Coast in search of the American dream. And then in the space of just a few years, it was bought, traded, and leveraged by a whole bunch of people who are all close to Donald Trump. And then I was like, oh my God, this is like a movie. And then I kept reporting, and I found another house that was, this one had been owned by a white family living in the suburbs northwest of LA in Thousand Oaks, California, where the father was a World War II veteran. And it was the same parade of actors. It was the same bank that sold them a predatory reverse mortgage, the same bank owned by Steve Mnuchin that foreclosed on them. And the same Trumpies who came in and traded. And I just, it was just heartbreaking, but also explained a lot about why we were in such bad shape as a country. And I had a lot of fun writing it also, because all this can sound very depressing, but it was kind of fun to learn that Steve Mnuchin drove a Porsche to high school. And, you know, like these other details kind of like get into the lifestyles of the rich and famous part of it. In fact, a lot of them even live in the same building on Park Avenue in New York. So 740 Park Avenue, which was called the world's richest apartment building. So, you know, you could buy a condo there if you had $25 million yourself, if you wanted to. You have less than that.
Yeah. Okay. No, thank you. And then if I don't think there's any more questions, if you have any last remarks, I think we're.
Well, I just want to thank you all, and keep in touch. I appreciate all the work that you're doing at the Fair Housing Association in Montgomery, and we are living in a pretty important time. You and I were talking before all this started, and I was saying that I'm amazed, and I said this in my presentation, that things are not worse than they are, but you were talking to me about some of the challenges that you all are facing. And so I think the main thing is these moratoria have bought us some time that we did not have in 2008. And so using that time as best we can is really important.
Yeah, I agree. Maybe I'm a bit of a pessimist, but there's a pending, I was like, where we had the foreclosure crisis in 08, we're on the precipice of a possible eviction crisis. And that's what we're really fearful of. And I know a lot of national organizations are also. So we're hopeful that the moratorium has bought time, and the extensions have been a godsend to so many people. But there's still that very real issue of what happens when it's over.
Yes, and the other thing that I was saying while we were getting ready, that you all, we have an unprecedented number of properties all across this country that are not being bought by families. They're in fact being bought by shell companies with cash. And I've been talking this talk about mortgage lending and who's able to access credit. And then I've been talking about some of these big national actors who are friends of Donald Trump who bought a ton. But there's also a lot of small, medium-sized speculators that are active. And I was just working with a journalist in Milwaukee who is identifying speculators from all over the country who are coming in and buying the housing stock in Milwaukee out from under families, primarily in Black and brown neighborhoods. And I would definitely suggest that as you look at your fair housing investigations, look at who's buying property in Montgomery, and especially in these gentrifying neighborhoods, and ask yourself, is this a case where, you know, as I was saying in Philadelphia, you have these like white graduate students who, you know, are upwardly mobile, but financially rickety. And, you know, that's one kind of unfairness. But another thing that could be happening in Montgomery right now is you could have people putting down cash and scooping up property and leaving the housing vacant, renting it out for high prices, not giving it adequate attention for maintenance, because let's face it, they're not even there. And so that's another thing to be watchful of, I think.
Okay. Well, we are so thankful that you took your time out of today to speak with us about this, and for all the research that you've done into redlining and lending discrimination. I have not read your book yet, but I am going to. I'm very excited about it. So I just want to thank you for your time and for everybody who has joined us today.
Thank you so much. Appreciate this opportunity so much, and don't be a stranger.
Okay.